Hi everyone! In this video, we are going to be talking about what is poetry, as well as the different types of poetry we will be looking at this year in 8th grade. So, a basic definition of poetry is a type of literature that is based on what we call the interplay of words and rhythm. That basically means that words and the rhythm that we are speaking them at work together in order to form kind of like a song-like output. So I like to say that songs actually are a form of poetry because a lot of songs also work on the interplay of words and rhythm within their piece. The sole difference is one is sung and one is mostly spoken or read. So in addition to using this interplay of words and rhythm, it also uses, at least often, not always, rhyme and meter. So rhyme is basically when words rhyme with each other, and meter is the amount of emphasis throughout the poem and throughout the lines. So there are 3 types of poetry that we will be talking about in 8th grade. The first is a lyric, which these are poems that focus on thoughts and emotions. So specifically, writers use them to convey their thoughts and emotions and try to put that back onto the reader so the reader can understand those emotions. Narrative poems are just poems that tell a story, similar to when we write narrative or creative writing. And then lastly, we have dramatic. So these are poems that are in verse and are meant to be spoken aloud. So there are a few main types of lyric poems. The first is an elegy. So an elegy is a poem that mourns the death of a person. There is no specific rhyme scheme or line amount with this specific type of poem. So we actually studied the most famous elegy poem ever earlier this year, which is "O Captain, My Captain," which elegizes Abraham Lincoln after his assassination in 1865. Another type of lyric poem that we have is a haiku. You've probably heard of haikus before because they're very famous and simple poems. So haikus are 3-line Japanese poems that have nature themes. They almost always focus on something to do with nature. Instead of following a rhyme scheme, this actually follows a syllable scheme. So it follows a 5-7-5 syllable scheme. This basically means that the first line of your haiku will be 5 syllables. Your second line will be 7 syllables, and your fifth line and your third line will be 5 syllables. Usually these poems don't rhyme. You could have them rhyme, but usually they don't. The next 2 types of lyric poems are the sonnet and the limerick. So the sonnet was made famous by 2 people. We mostly look at the one, which is Shakespeare, but there's also a guy named Petrarch who also made the sonnet famous. But they are both shorter poems that have 14 lines. A sonnet will always have 14 lines, and we do that in, there are 3 stanzas of 4 lines, and then what we call a rhyming couplet, which is a stanza with 2 lines. The typical Shakespearean rhyme scheme that we will look at in ELA 8 is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. There is another rhyme scheme that your sonnet could be, which is A, B, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, F, F, G, G. And every single one of these rhymes is written in what's called iambic pentameter. Now we're going to dive a little bit more in depth with iambic pentameter when we study Shakespeare at the end of the year. So really, that will be something that we point out, but it's not going to be something overly major that we focus on right this very moment. And then the last type of lyric poem is a limerick. A limerick is a comedic poem that only has 5 lines. Okay, so there is a rhyme scheme for a limerick, which is A, B, B, A. The first, the second, and the fifth line, so those A rhyme scheme lines, are longer than our B rhyme scheme lines. So that's something important to remember. So now we're going to move on to narrative poems. Okay, our first type of narrative poem is an epic. So an epic is a long narrative poem that tells the story of heroic deeds of a person of an unusual courage and unparalleled bravery. Basically, these poems were big during Greek and Roman times, as well as early in the world's history. So next year, you guys will be reading a very famous epic called the Odyssey, which tells the story of a man named Odysseus as he's trying to come back from the Trojan War. There's also another very famous rhyme scheme, or another very famous epic that you might read in high school called Beowulf, which is basically the story of a guy named Beowulf who is trying to kill this monster named Grendel. But basically, they all deal with courage and bravery. There is no specific rhyme scheme or line amount for epics. Epics can go on for almost a full book, but there is no really specific amount. And they're usually meant to be spoken aloud. The way we got epics is they were told and passed down from generation to generation before writing even was a thing. So they're meant to be spoken aloud, but we also can read them as well. The next type of narrative poem is a ballad. So a ballad kind of walks this line between lyric and narrative. It kind of combines the two. So a ballad is a more lyrical poem that is sometimes set to music. Ballads, you might have heard if you have heard of them in music class, where you can sing a ballad, but we also have ballad poetries. So in every ballad, your stanzas will have 4 lines. So obviously there's no specific stanza amount, but every stanza will have 4 lines. And typically somewhere in there will be a repeated refrain or line. We're going to be studying one of the most famous ballad poems in this unit. But basically, you'll be able to see that there's a repeated refrain or line that shows up every once in a while. So then our last type of poem is a dramatic poem. So the most famous and current dramatic poetry would be a type of poetry called spoken word, which is poetry that is intended for performance. It contains elements of things like rap, hip hop, storytelling, theater, and jazz, rock, blues, and folk music. Basically, it, in my opinion, does a really great job of basically combining things like rap and theater into one awesome performance piece. It mostly refers to the issues that the author or the country is facing. It's all very personal if you look up any type of slam poetry or spoken word, and there's no specific length. Normally, a slam poet or a spoken word poet won't go more than 5 to 10 minutes, but there is no specific length. So hopefully we'll be able to have a chance to look at some spoken word, but if not, I highly recommend you just look up spoken word. There's some really great pieces online. But that is everything you need to know in order to be successful for your poetry unit.